Let's see if this is working. Thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Emily and Michelle for coming to Chicago. Welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
So we're in this moment, a fascinating, fascinating moment. And there's a lot to understand about all of the history of it, how it began, where we are in it, and where we're headed. And I think that the only thing I'm concerned about tonight is that 1 hour may not be nearly enough to get through everything there is to say. So let's jump right in. Michelle, you know, when you think back about sexual harassment, we've been talking about this as a country and as a world since at least Anita Hill in 1991. Why now does this feel different, do you think?
So my theory, and it's just a theory, is that this is largely a response to the trauma of Trump's election, right? I mean, it was so degrading and infuriating, obviously not for all women, but for a great many women. And so in the wake of the election, you saw women starting to try to exercise power in whatever realms they could, because we were so cut out of power at the national level. So women all over the country have poured into local politics. You've seen the exponential, I mean, you saw the Women's March, the growth of Indivisible, which is largely a women-led movement. And I think that there was a similar impetus at play in a lot of these Me Too stories, where women felt like, okay, we can't do anything about the sexual harasser in the White House, but there's the sexual harasser I know in my own company, or my own industry. And which is, again, why I think that aside from Bill O'Reilly and Fox News, a lot of the people that have been taken down have been in fairly left-leaning industries, media, Hollywood, the arts, places where women, where this kind of rage was able to manifest itself, and where there was, where they had leverage because people cared. You kind of had to respond when there was overwhelming evidence that there was a predator at the top.
And do you feel like this really is different? That this is not just one moment, not a blip? We talked a little bit back in 1991 that we were having a moment. Is this going to stick around?
Well, I think the thing that's different is that you see a lot of powerful men who've lost their jobs. That's really new. That almost never happened in the past. And so whether that will continue to happen, I do feel like there's a little bit of a petering out of the momentum and maybe a little bit of exhaustion. It's been interesting to me to see the response to the accusations against Tom Brokaw. And I can't speak to the validity of them one way or the other, but he wrote this letter in response that really repeated a lot of kind of tropes that are typically used against women who level these sort of claims, saying that she was just responding to her own professional failure and her own, lack of distinction, and that it was look at me instead of me too. And it was interesting to me. I think that a few months ago, there would have been a lot stronger pushback to the way he framed the issue than there was now. I mean, I think there's just so much else going on now, and people's attention has flagged a little bit.
Interesting. So Emily, let's talk about Bill O'Reilly. Let's think back a little bit to even more broadly than Bill O'Reilly. How did the newspaper and media beyond just the New York Times pick up on this now? What got you started in the Bill O'Reilly case, and what else was happening in the newsroom and in other newsrooms that got people really engaged on this now?
So to think about how the Times really got so invested and so devoted to this coverage of sexual harassment and these issues, you really have to go all the way back to the summer of 2016. There was a lawsuit then that was filed by Gretchen Carlson. She's the former anchor at Fox News, and she filed this pretty salacious lawsuit that was public against Roger Ailes, who was then the chairman of Fox News and wielded extraordinary power and extraordinary influence over cable TV, cable news, the media, politics, and more. So she filed this lawsuit. It really exploded into the media story of the summer. Roger Ailes, instead of being supported by the Murdochs, was ousted after an investigation that found that there had been several women who had filed these complaints of of sexual harassment against him. And it was just this story that was just like endless, and we were chasing it and trying to keep up and trying to figure out how we could get ahead. And in August of that summer, Dean Baquet, who is the executive editor of the Times, called a meeting, and we really were trying to figure out, like, how can we get ahead of this story? How can we really figure out what's going on here? Because it was pretty clear that it wasn't just Roger Ailes at the top of Fox News, but it was a kind of a system and a culture that was pervasive throughout that entire network. And so we called this meeting, and Dean remembered this lawsuit from 2004. And it was this young woman named Andrea Macris, who was in her early 30s and had worked for Bill O'Reilly. She filed a public lawsuit against him in 2004 that had included a number of lurid and salacious allegations of sexual harassment. Dean had remembered that maybe there had been tapes. He remembered that there had been a multi-million-dollar settlement, and then the case just kind of disappeared. So Dean thought, why don't you go back and re-report what had happened in 2004, kind of with the perspective and the knowledge of what we now know? And what does this say about how the network handled this? What does this say about whether there was a chilling effect for women at the network? And just kind of go and see what you can find. And so I was paired up with Michael Schmidt, who's a fantastic reporter in DC, and we just started making calls and making more calls and making more calls and just really trying to figure out what had happened in that October 2004 period. And in the midst of that reporting, we started to find that she wasn't alone, that she was not the only one. So we went back to our editors and we thought, we think this can be a bigger story. And so they said, keep going, keep going. And several months later, we started the reporting in August. We published a story on April 1st of 2017 that we had found that there had been this record of harassment, of allegations of harassment, that there had been millions of dollars of settlements, that the company was aware of this, that they knew about it, and had continued to support Bill O'Reilly. And then,
just when you think about that piece of the story, that April story that sort of opened this all up, because it showed that there had been all of these settlements that happened, was there some key moment that sealed that made that story work? What did you get? How did you get that?
Everybody asks us that question because I think it's great for storytelling if there is one moment, but it was really this months long, really, really hard reporting. You have to remember, this is a year before any of the Me Too movement came out. Nobody wanted to talk about this. Nobody thought that they would be believed. What we found to be 6 settlements that total $45 million, they all included very strict, ironclad confidentiality agreements. If any person who was a party of that agreement was found to have talked to us or had shared any information with us, they would have faced millions of dollars worth of penalties. Mm-hmm. So it was just this gradual slog of knocking on doors, making phone calls, knocking on doors, getting doors slammed in our face, writing handwritten cards, and then somebody would pick up and somebody would talk to us. And it was really just this long slog of figuring that all out. But it was once we actually figured out that there had been this record of harassment, of allegations of harassment, and this record of settlements that went back more than a dozen years. It was kind of his whole tenure at Fox News that we realized that there was a story here. Yeah. It was a big story.
Yeah, this is the dirty little secret of journalism, right? It actually looks like that, and not like you find the magical document that solves it all.
Well, one thing that's kind of interesting is during this reporting, Mike Schmidt and I, we didn't really know how to do this reporting. So there were a lot of times that we were kind of bumping our head against the wall.
What do you mean? What do you mean though when you say you didn't know how?
Well, we didn't really know what we were looking for, and we also didn't know how do you figure out that there is this record of confidentiality agreements that nobody can talk about. But there was a point in the reporting where one of our sources said, this is really similar to how the Catholic Church handled priests who were abusing children. And so Mike and I thought, let's go read the Boston Globe's coverage, the Spotlight coverage of the sex abuse scandal. Right. And we watched the movie and we kind of recreated a lot of their reporting, and it was really helpful to us. So we really followed that blueprint. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like, I don't know if anyone in the audience saw this or listened to this, but there was this great the Daily episode where he played a recording of your and Mike's interview with Bill O'Reilly, and it was really quite remarkable. But over a period of time, you had dealings with him, and they sound incredibly tense dealings. And in fact, he said, I guess at one point, "I'm coming after you with everything I've got." He said that to you. So hearing all of that, I wonder how his response to you affected your work and affected how you were handling the story.
So Bill O'Reilly, he did threaten me, and it's interesting because it happened in a different context for a different story that I had been reporting on.
A few years earlier, right?
It was in February of 2015. There had just been this big scandal at NBC where Brian Williams had been ousted after claims that he had lied about his record of being on a helicopter that had been shot down in Iraq. And then Mother Jones did a subsequent investigation into O'Reilly's claims of being a war reporter, where they said that he had said that he was a war reporter, but he had actually only reported on the protests of the Falklands War from the streets of Buenos Aires. And so I had called Fox News for comment to try to kind of follow the facts and write a fair and accurate story. And O'Reilly called me back, and straight away, I kind of had this set up at my desk where I pick up my phone and then I just kind of start typing and not recording, but kind of taking notes of what people say. And right away, he said that he thought that my reporting so far had been fair, but if I did anything that he found untoward, he would come after me with everything that he had, and that I could take that as a threat. And then I said, okay, can I now ask you some questions? But then after we got off the phone, then I told my editors, and we put that in the story, and I tweeted it, and it kind of erupted into this big thing, because for a long time, people who had reported on Fox News kind of had these stories, but a lot of that had happened off the record and out of the public spotlight. So it was really powerful to put that on the record.
Yeah.
But that whole thing had happened before we were reporting on this record of harassment. And what we really tried to do was to follow the facts of the story and to be fair and to be accurate and to know that O'Reilly's lawyer was knocking on the door of David McCraw, who's the lawyer for the New York Times, and saying that there had been no record of any woman at Fox News reporting any issues of harassment regarding Bill O'Reilly. And we knew that we were kind of facing this, but we also knew that there's a story here, and we need it to be fair, we need it to be accurate, and we need it to be bulletproof.
Yeah. So Michelle, we've certainly learned a lot about sexual harassment in Hollywood, in media, in a bunch of sort of high-level companies. Has the Me Too movement reached down into sort of what the average American lives?
I don't think we know that yet. I mean, there's certainly been really good reporting, including in the Times, about people in more obscure industries or more obscure professions who've had to reckon with sexual harassment. But whether it has, my sense is that there's a generational change, right? There's kind of a generation of men who maybe believed that it was okay to take liberties or use their authority in certain ways, and that there's another generation coming up who just has kind of a different expectation about the way men and women behave in the workplace. But I don't think we know if this is going to be a sea change as opposed to a kind of brief moment of moral fervor after which everything just returns to the status quo. And there's also quite a significant backlash against the Me Too movement, and huge movements of aggrieved young men, aggrieved men elected, not singularly, but helped elect Donald Trump president. They've made Jordan Peterson, one of the most influential public intellectuals maybe in the Western world right now, who kind of says, well, maybe this movement means that just the experiment with co-ed offices, with men and women working together, has been a failure that we have to rethink. And so, in a way, we're sort of relitigating pre-feminist premises, even as in other parts of the culture we're making real progress. So I think it's too early to see how it's all gonna shake out.
But is there a concern that somehow this is an elite problem and not a problem that is being answered, that it's not being looked at closely enough for average Americans?
Well, I don't think anybody thinks that it's an elite problem, but I think that the people who've been able to get like restitution or been able to get some measure of justice have been not totally, but disproportionately elite, and disproportionately in really high-profile industries, right? Like you can kind of say this man, you know, who's at the top of his field that everybody has heard of, has this terrible history, and you can, you know, there's journalists will dig into it. I mean, I think it's, and part of the problem too, right, is just the hollowing out of local newspapers. So there's not kind of, you know, necessarily an investigative team to report on how the, I don't know, like a city councilman in Missoula or something has been abusing his.
One thing that I think is pretty interesting, though, is I've been on a couple of college campuses lately and met a couple of college kids. And at their student newspapers, they're all furiously reporting on this topic.
Really?
Yeah, and they said that it's been very much inspired by reporting in the Times and elsewhere, and that they see this as an important topic for them to cover and for them to really focus and pay attention to and look into. And so I think that it's interesting because I think we are continuing to see stories be reported. The Times just published a big investigation about the workplace and the situation at Nike this weekend.
Right.
And in addition, we're really looking at more systemic issues that have allowed this problem to perpetuate. So what has gone on in HR departments that have made it so that the executives and the most senior people at companies were protected rather than the people who worked for them. What is going on with these non-disclosure agreements that very often have allowed a perpetrator to continue to abuse people, whereas their victims were silenced and nobody knew that there was a problem. What's gone on with the law, that why is the law written in a way that's pretty hazy and fuzzy? And so I think we're seeing a lot of exploration in those issues, but it's not as salacious and kind of tweet-worthy and attention-grabbing when it's a huge, powerful man and salacious allegations against him and the downfall of that person.
Yeah, that is interesting. When you think about it, I can think in local papers in the Midwest, it now has to reach a pretty high bar for us we sort of say, well, that one, they've got this covered. This isn't a national story. So it's interesting, maybe it's playing out in smaller realms all over the place. So as with every issue, once we start talking about it, there's a debate about it, right? So you have the Aziz Ansari case, there's a debate sort of over what is sexual harassment, what is sexual assault, where is the line on that, and should there be even a line? Is there a gradation, or is that inappropriate, and any wrong step should be out?
Right.
What do you make of that? And is there a generational thing?
Well, I think yes, I do think there's a generational thing, and I also think there's a lot of, there was almost the second Me Too started, there was a lot of anxiety about Me Too going too far, and kind of has this thing gone out of control. But I think in general, when you look at the men who've suffered serious professional consequences, and not to minimize the embarrassment that someone like Aziz Ansari had to suffer, but when you look at the people who've lost their jobs, have kind of lost their careers, they actually weren't borderline cases. I guess the one exception would be Al Franken. But the other people, Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, Harvey Weinstein, Bill O'Reilly, right? These are not like, oh, no, we don't know what the new rules are. Yes, you do. Like, don't take out your penis ever. Don't. And then I think just when you look at something like the Aziz Ansari story, the ferocity of the pushback to me suggested that, no, we haven't just kind of started, kind of one strike, you're out, right? That there was this young woman who was sort of pushing the boundaries of this movement by trying to expand the discussion around Me Too to cover a really uncomfortable but also obviously consensual sexual experience. And it sparked a lot of discussion, but I think there was also a lot of reaction and people saying, no, that's something different. And there's a discussion to be had about why so many women are sort of grudgingly consenting to sex that they don't necessarily want, but it's not the same thing as these cases of professional coercion and retaliation. And so, again, I think that the debate, the fact that there's so much debate about Me Too is in a way an answer to those people who say, well, how come we can't criticize Me Too, and why are it's becoming this sort of kind of Stalinist movement in which we disappear people. I think that's not actually what's happening. And in fact, we're already, it's only been a few months, and now the debate has moved into how do we rehabilitate these men.
Yeah, which is another fascinating area. On Al Franken, you wrote a column that said he needed to step down.
Right. So I love Al Franken. Before any of this, I was hoping that he would run for president. I'd reported on him when he first was going to run for Senate. I'd also heard rumors about him being a grabber. And so when this picture came out, what I initially thought was this is going to play out the way these always play out, which is that there's one thing, and then there's a trickle and more and more and more. And my first thought was my God, we just need to this is heartbreaking, but you just need to cauterize this wound. Don't make his female colleagues go out and defend him when there's more that's going to come. And so I wrote that piece, and it's one of the things about being a columnist, right? Sometimes you kind of have to form opinions very quickly. I wrote that piece really as soon as it was sent to print. I thought, I've made a terrible mistake. Al Franken is a good man, and I think that this stuff is going to come out, but we shouldn't be condemning people until we actually know what's going to come out. And so I wrote, kind of an apology, basically saying I was wrong to draw such a quick and stark conclusion about Al Franken, and I did it based on what I assumed was going to happen, not on what actually happened. But then I published that piece, and then more accusations did start coming out. And it's not that I think that grabbing someone's butt or even grabbing a lot of women's butts is the worst thing in the world, but I do think that he became a real liability to a lot of his female colleagues who just had to answer, what about Al Franken, every time they spoke out about anything. And so at a certain point, just, not as a question of morality, but as a question of utility, it was the right thing to do, and for him to step aside. And one of the ironies, I think, about this whole thing is that when you think about who has really paid a price for the Me Too movement, certainly Al Franken, but also really Kirsten Gillibrand, has paid, I think, a greater professional price than a lot of men, because, you hear from fundraisers that they are not going to support her ever again because they're so angry about how she personally forced Al Franken out of the Senate, which is not what happened.
But there were, to be fair, when Franken stepped down, that same day, a number of women senators had stepped forward and said he has to go.
Right, and she did it by a few minutes, before I think the
Oh, it was minutes? Okay.
Yeah, it was pretty quickly that they started all doing it, but she has shouldered an enormous amount of the blame for this.
That's, really fascinating. On switching politicians for a second, you've also said that you thought we might want to re-examine Bill Clinton's actions. What kind of reaction do you get from that thought?
Well, I think, to me, the difficult thing about Bill Clinton's actions, the whole history of that, is that there really was a vast right-wing conspiracy, right? And so there really were people who were willing to trump up charges against him. I think that false accusations are relatively rare, except maybe when you have a kind of vicious political, weapon of mass destruction. And so some of these accusations against Bill Clinton are hard to credit. Kathleen Wiley says that, Bill Clinton sexually assaulted her, but she also says that he murdered her dog. So some of them are easy to dismiss, and I think that what a lot of people who didn't want to believe the worst about Bill Clinton did in the 90s, and what I think I definitely did, was to use the fact that some of them are easy to dismiss them all. And I had revisited, when Hillary Clinton was running for president before the election, I had kind of gone back and looked again at the Juanita Broaddrick case. And the Juanita Broaddrick case is really hard to explain away because she did all of the things that we now talk about women doing to kind of corroborate their own stories. You know, she told several people contemporaneously. And the things that were then used to discredit her when she first came forward are things that we now know are actually not uncommon among people who are victims of sexual assault. You know, so one of the things was, well, she went to a fundraiser with him, I think it was a week or two later, and so why would she do that if she'd been sexually assaulted? And actually, people, you know, often it takes them time to process things, and they do maintain some sort of contact with their abuser. And so, basically, where I come down on Juanita Broaddrick is basically, you know, this set of facts with anyone else, I would find totally believable. And so I don't see, you know, any reason to disbelieve her. What I don't believe her about is when she says that Hillary Clinton intimidated her, only because even if you take her at her word, which I do, she basically said Hillary Clinton came up to her at this political fundraiser and said, you know, thank you for everything you do for Bill. We really appreciate it. She took that as some kind of a veiled threat. I think you can understand that as just the banality of a political spouse greeting people at a fundraiser that she doesn't know. And it's interesting how badly Juanita Broaddrick wants to be believed. I mean, she's contacted me since then and just said, like, thank you. It meant so much to me for you to say that you believed me. You know, she was really
one of the things that I think is like a really significant shift and change has happened really just in the past couple of years is how much we do believe women and how much we really understand a lot more about how victims of harassment or victims of assault might respond. And I think one of the things that we did a lot with the reporting is we went back to 2004 and read all of the coverage about this young woman who worked for this powerful man, who had recordings of him kind of making these sexual fantasies and saying all of these things that were wildly inappropriate. And we went back and we read the tabloid stories. We watched the news coverage at the time, and it was so starkly different than how we would cover that story today. The initial round of the stories were all about the very salacious claims, and then the next round of stories were fed by information that had been dug up by private investigators, given to Bill O'Reilly and Fox News' side, and then leaked to the tabloid press that painted this woman as a promiscuous woman who was out to shake him down. And that wasn't an anomaly at the time. That's how a lot of those stories were told. And so I think it's really significant now that we are listening to these women and listening to the stories and definitely questioning them and making sure that there is contemporaneous memos or emails or whatever, but it's just a really different time and culture about how we as a society listen to these stories and think about changes and shifts of power dynamic and other things too.
Can that, just to be the devil's advocate here, can that go too far? Can that go to where you've certainly heard people who say, we have to believe her no matter what? Is there a risk in that?
I think that there is a risk, but I think as reporters, and like myself especially, been really diligent to try to make sure that what we're reporting on are these settlements where there is, with the case of O'Reilly, that $45 million that have been paid to these women, or even I wrote a story about Vice Media, which is more of a youth millennial media company. But I had found that there were 4 settlements and tens of thousands of dollars paid for each of those settlements. And then also with the stories of the women who are coming forward, we're making sure, at least with our coverage, that they go on the record with those stories. And we don't just believe them. It's not like we have a hotline where people call and then we put the stories straight into the paper. We ask them about these stories several times. We ask them to talk to people that they had told this at the time. We look at emails, we look at text messages, we look at voicemails, and we also go to the person who's been accused and say, what is your response? We want to hear your side of the story. And so I think that we're really trying to be as responsible as we can with that reporting.
Yeah. Does talk a little bit about that Vice story. I think what struck me about it was that it was a younger group of people. These weren't 70-year-old men who maybe didn't understand. These were 30s, 20s, and they had a really amazing culture there.
Yeah, what was so powerful to me about that story was that it was published in December, and it came after this wave of allegations against powerful men, mostly in their 60s and their 70s, and whose excuse for all of this behavior was that they were an old dinosaur who had grown up in the 60s and the 70s, and that's just how they thought. They thought that they should treat women in the workplace. And this story was so powerful because I found that there had been 4 settlements that had included the most senior men at the company. But in addition, I had a number of women who were all in their 20s and early 30s to go on the record with these allegations that were really, really serious about other young men at the company. And it showed kind of how much sexual harassment is tied to power as much as it is tied to sex. It showed how ingrained in our culture this issue is. One of the most chilling parts of that story was this anecdote about the HR woman who, when women went to her with complaints, she told people things like, well, you're just a really beautiful woman. You're just going to have to face these things in your career. And so I thought that was a really powerful story to kind of complement the rest of our coverage.
That's great. So we're going to go to some audience questions in just a moment. So come up with some good questions. But I've got one more. Bill Cosby, the verdict came out last week, and there are a number of people who are looking at that as compared to his earlier trial as a sign of a change in what we think about this sort of thing. So what do you all think? Is this a change, or is this just one case?
I think that we won't know until it's more than one case. But I mean, to me, the thing that strikes me is that, again, there's so much anxiety out there. And I guess, as a civil libertarian, you want there to be anxiety about people being unjustly accused. But then when you look at the amount of evidence that is necessary for people to face serious consequences, it seems that the emphasis is misplaced, right? Because I think that we so often, or so much more often, see women whose lives are derailed or whose careers are derailed, and kind of aren't believed even if there are 16 people saying the same thing, or even if they have contemporaneous records. It's still, I think, what it takes to make people take this seriously is still just like an enormous amount of evidence.
I think that we also, it's like what you said before, that there's been a huge shift in education in our culture about these issues, and we've been forced to confront them and have these sometimes awkward and uncomfortable conversations. But I think we're learning a lot more about these issues, and also about kind of how victims might respond, and how, like, why you might write a thank you card to somebody who has abused you, and kind of all of these things that before you would say, well, she's got to be lying, because why would you do that? And I think that's really kind of changing our culture. But I think really, like what Michelle just said, is to really understand how this is changing, or whether this is like the straw that broke the camel's back. Right. It's going to take time, I think, to really see how this all unfolds.
Yeah. All right. Fantastic. If there are questions, there should be a microphone going around. I can't actually see you all, but if you would just stand up, take a microphone. He's got a microphone right here, and give us your name and a question. Now I can see you.
Can you hear me?
Oops. Yeah.
My name is Lori. I'd like to go back and revisit the Tom Brokaw thing, because I have 2 aspects of that I would like to ask about. First, about the idea of one accuser versus many accusers. In that situation, at least so far of what we know, it's one person.
Well, 2.
Well, it's 2, but the other person's not identified,
right.
So we don't know really anything. And I guess it was interesting because you were talking about Al Franken, will there be more? And I'm feeling just like when we get to thinking about a situation like Cosby, what did it take, like 50 or more people just the idea of one accuser versus many accusers. Are we approaching the idea that one person can stand up, or does it have to be a group? And the second question I wanted to ask about Tom Brokaw was this idea of many people signing a letter saying, we believe Tom Brokaw. I found that very, I'm very mixed about that happened, and I was just wondering if you'd comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that part of the reason why, I mean, there was a story about Tom Brokaw, and it wasn't just her, it was one woman going on the record who had also told a bunch of people at the time, right? And even some of the details he hasn't exactly refuted as much as kind of put them in a different light. Like, yes, I went to go kiss you goodbye, but my memory is that it was by the door, not by the chair. So, you know, but I think the idea being that there was a different set of social rules about how you interact with a colleague, you know, when you're alone with them, when this took place, and is it really fair to judge somebody retroactively? I'm not sure about that, but I mean, I think that, you know, Tom Brokaw is obviously very angry about this coverage, but he's very unlikely to face professional consequences unless there actually is a whole bunch more women. And if it was true, and I don't think we know that, you know, he kind of used the fact that this woman's career was undistinguished to impugn her credibility, although you could also, you know, flip it around and say, well, you know, there's one reason why so many women's careers end up being derailed, and it's because they have to, you know, they look for mentors, and this is what they get. I think that I also have very mixed feelings about the letter, because on the one hand, I think it's a natural impulse to want to support your friend and colleague, but it actually doesn't tell you very much to say, well, this person never sexually harassed me. I mean, it really doesn't. And it's kind of bizarre to think that, you know, that's not, like, I'm sure that anybody, you know, I'm sure that Harvey Weinstein could have come up with 100 people to sign a letter saying that he had never sexually harassed them personally. It doesn't kind of, you know, inoculate him.
All right, let's get another question.
Okay, I've got the microphone here, right over here.
Oh, great, thanks. What's your name?
Noel Hertz. I'm a sex therapist and a psychotherapist and have been for some 45 years now. And my career started working with the Department of Children and Family Services investigating reports of child sexual abuse. What I want to say is the difference that I'm hearing tonight as to what I heard beginning 40 years ago is who it was that is being accused of these things. These are very prominent people like Bill O'Reilly. He's, you know, well known. The people I was dealing with were parents and relatives of kids who were claiming that they were being sexually abused. And it was very difficult for anybody to listen to a lot of these kids. So I'm saying I don't think that this is a new issue. I think it's time that we start looking at the idea of education about sexuality. If you'll notice, when a penis got mentioned, we had a ripple of some of, you know, just a whole lot of laughter, which to me indicates being really uncomfortable about dealing with things like penises. And if we've got that kind of thing going on, it's going to be very difficult for people to make reports that you're talking about.
So what's your question?
I just wanted to hear your reactions about that. It isn't just the things that you're talking about, that this is part of the entire society.
Well, I don't think anybody thinks that this is new, right? I mean, I think that what people think is new is that there are consequences for it, right? I mean, pretty sure that people believe.
And one of the things that I think was so powerful is that as a society, we always heard these statistics and knew the number of men and women who had been victims of harassment or abuse. But what was so powerful about the Me Too movement really being unleashed on social media earlier this year or late last year was that we actually heard the voices behind those stories, and people had the courage to be able to tell them. And as a society, we really started to listen. And I think that's kind of the first step in societies making changes, is to talk about these issues. And I think that's kind of where we are.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Question over on your left.
Great. What's your name?
My name is Janet Muchnick. Despite the Howard Stern interviews, despite the interview about pussy grabbing, despite all of the women who accused Trump, how do you explain that not only was there not national outrage, white women gave him his margin of victory?
Michelle?
So, I mean, I think that the, part of it is just we're talking about different demographics, right? So the people in general, the people who kind of came forward about Harvey Weinstein, or the people who came forward about Matt Lauer, some of these other figures, were, in some sense, we're not the same people who supported Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's election, the fact that he could be elected after saying all these things, after all of these multifarious allegations, after talking in a sexually demeaning way about his own daughter, was a huge wake-up call, I think, to a lot of people about just how, deep misogyny goes in this culture. And, I think it was stunning to a lot of women, frankly, about, their place in this country and kind of, how many of their fellow citizens don't necessarily regard them as full human beings. And so what you're seeing now is the rippling reaction to that monumental insult. But part of the tricky thing is that reaction is happening among people who are outraged by Trump, which is why it's been, I think, largely confined to liberal-leaning industries. Why it hasn't, say, rocked the hedge fund industry, which I think is extremely unlikely to be less sexist than, publishing. But, but it's kind of women, it's the people who are most outraged by Trump who are trying to do something where they can, which is often kind of in their own circles. Meanwhile, you've seen people, Blake Farenthold just resigned and still isn't going to pay back his sexual harassment settlement. There's just much less of a drumbeat in conservative circles in response to that, which in a weird way results in more impunity for conservative men. Look at Elliot Broidy, this RNC fundraiser who paid off a Playboy bunny $1.6 million, I believe, after getting her to have an abortion. You don't see a similar drumbeat to, force the RNC to give back his donations or to give back Steve Wynn's donations, for that matter. And again, I think it's partly because the people who are most outraged by Trump, the institutions that they have leverage over are not necessarily commensurate with the institutions where the problem is the worst.
One thing to add on to that is that it's pretty interesting because I was reporting on the O'Reilly story, who was the king of cable news and led Fox News, which is a huge kind of very popular with conservatives. And we were reporting on that story before the election and then after the election. And one thing that I did notice is that after the election and after the Access Hollywood tape came out, there were a number of sources who told us it's really important that we talk about this because this isn't a referendum on how women in this country should be treated. And there were a number of people who kind of came forward in our reporting who may have been reticent or reluctant before. And in addition, our story about Bill O'Reilly, it published on April 1st. He wasn't fired from Fox News until 18 days later. And in that period, there was Donald Trump who came forward in support of Bill O'Reilly, saying that he was a great guy and would never treat anybody terribly. And that prompted this huge wave of protest and advertisers who boycotted his show, and protests outside of Fox News, and an airplane that flew over New York City that said, "Drop O'Reilly, the sexual predator." And I do think that those two things may be related.
We have time for just 2 more questions, one here and then one in the back.
My name is Mary. Okay. My name is Mary Ellen O'Hare-Lavin. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have a story, but I also have a question after that, so I'll try to. As a Jungian psychotherapist, I look for images and myths, and there is a myth in the mess. It goes back to Greek mythology. It's the myth of Apollo and Cassandra. You may remember this myth. Apollo wanted to take Cassandra to bed, and she said no. She said, "I'm going to report you to the higher gods." And he said, "Go ahead. You can keep your gift of prophecy, but nobody will ever believe you." So what's happening now has an archetypal pattern of behavior. It goes back to Greek mythology. And now for my question. How has this Me Too movement affected your profession as journalists? Have you had any experience in the workplace with predators?
Do you want me to answer it? Do you want to answer it?
I mean, well, for me personally, there was this, when I was working at the Wall Street Journal, I was maybe like 23, 24 years old, and there was this guy who was a security guard who worked by the elevator, who was kind of creepy, and he would just say weird things that really just made me feel uncomfortable. And I told another reporter about this. She told our editor. The editor talked to me. They talked to HR, and then there had been a file on this guy, and he was let go from the company. So it was actually like a really good example of how these things should operate. But I think that was one of the things that while I was doing this reporting, I was kind of so shocked by, because that had been my experience. But then I was talking to these girls or women at Vice who had said that the HR person just told them that that's kind of what they needed to expect. And I talked to women at Fox News who said, well, isn't it normal for your editor to condition work on oral sex? And I was outraged. And so I think that just my perspective was very interesting in my reporting. And then just kind of how it's affected my job is before all of this, I had been reporting a lot more, or I had been reporting about the media industry, and kind of since the O'Reilly story broke, I've really been focused on issues of harassment, and it's really been just a huge focus and investment for the coverage at the Times.
So I realized when all this was happening, all my friends had all these stories, and I really had very few. I mean, I had one from college, and then basically nothing. And there's several different reasons for this, but I think one of them I realized in my own case is that until I came to the Times relatively recently, I have worked, and I don't know how it ended up this way, but almost exclusively for publications headed by women. Like 5 different publications with female editor-in-chiefs, from The Nation to Tina Brown at Newsweek, Julia at Slate. I worked for Joan Walsh at Salon. It's always been women that have given me a chance. And again, I mean, there's no way to prove this, but to me, it has driven home that we just need more women in charge.
All right, let's take one more question.
That actually, my name is Francine, and that actually leads into a question that I have, and it goes to all 3 of you. During any of your investigations or any of the stories that you heard or what have you, were there ever any allegations of women being harassers?
Yes. Working here in the Midwest, we cover 11 states, including, I'm going to get the state wrong, there's a legislator in Kansas City, does this ring a bell? In Missouri or Kansas, who had to drop out of a race accused of sexual harassment. But I think that's the only one I know of. Yeah,
I mean, and there was like a mayor who resigned over there.
Right.
But I mean, Yeah, I think it's much more, it clearly happens, but it's obvious, but I think it's much, much more rare.
I think that's probably right. Do we have time for one more, or we're all really done?
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have.
Oh, that's all the time. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thanks to Emily and Michelle for coming. Really appreciate it. The conversation continues.